Have you ever noticed that the block of Cadbury dairy milk you leave in the cupboard doesn't actually melt anymore? It just sort of sweats and turns into a sad, rubbery slab of grease. Or maybe you've eaten a couple of squares of high-end dark chocolate to be healthy, only to end up with a bizarre, metallic aftertaste that coats your tongue for hours. You probably think it's just your imagination, or maybe you've just got an off batch. It isn't. You are systematically being fed cheap industrial fillers disguised as a luxury treat, and your body is screaming at you to notice by the time we finish this chat. You're going to know exactly how the confectionery giants are pulling off the ultimate magic trick right under your nose. I'll show you the laboratory data that exposed how some of the UK's most trusted brands are secretly laced with toxic heavy metals. We'll break down how corporate buyouts completely gutted classic British recipes, replacing real food with ingredients that actively wreck your cardiovascular system. Most importantly, you'll find out which bars on your local supermarket shelves are actually pure, life-saving superfoods and which ones are literal medical time bombs. And stick around, because the absolute worst offender on our list isn't some obscure import. It's a massive household name that accused its own customers of being stupid in open court just to avoid a lawsuit. Before we start naming and shaming the specific brands sitting in your kitchen right now, we need to talk about how a proper bar of chocolate is actually supposed to work. Think of real chocolate like a premium sports car. It needs high-quality engineering, and the engine under the hood is the cacao bean. When you harvest cacao, it gets separated into two main components: cocoa solids, which give you that rich flavor and massive health benefits, and cocoa butter, which is the natural fat that makes chocolate melt beautifully at exactly human body temperature. That's why real chocolate feels velvety on your tongue. It literally liquefies the second it touches your mouth. The mega corporations running the confectionery world don't care about engineering a sports car. They want to mass-produce cheap plastic mobility scooters. Real cocoa butter is incredibly expensive, so the global food industry has spent decades perfecting the art of the swap. They strip out the natural cocoa butter, sell it off to high-end cosmetic companies for a massive premium, and replace it in your chocolate bar with cheap, highly refined palm oil, shea butter, and industrial emulsifiers. It's the dietary equivalent of draining the premium synthetic oil from your engine and replacing it with leftover chip fat from the local takeaway. When they pull this stunt, the texture completely changes. To mask the fact that the chocolate now tastes like waxy cardboard and doesn't melt properly, they dump in absolute mountains of refined sugar and artificial vanillin. You think you're buying an indulgent cocoa treat, but you're actually paying a premium for a bar of solid vegetable grease and sugar that has merely been walked past a cocoa bean for formatting's sake. This stuff is engineered to bypass your brain's satiety signals, forcing you to overeat while overloading your liver and spiking your insulin levels. But it gets much worse than just cheap fats and sugar, because these massive conglomerates buy their cacao in catastrophic, industrial quantities from unregulated global supply chains. The raw materials are frequently contaminated. A shocking investigation by Consumer Reports recently sent shockwaves through the industry when they lab-tested popular dark chocolate bars. They found that because of contaminated soil and industrial processing shortcuts, many famous chocolates are packed with dangerous levels of lead and cadmium. These heavy metals accumulate in your organs over decades, quietly hammering your nervous system, raising your blood pressure, and suppressing your immune response. You think you're doing your health a favor by switching to dark chocolate, but the corporate version is quietly poisoning you from the inside out. Let's start the descent into the worst offenders on British shelves, starting with a brand that wraps itself in an organic, romantic image but hides a toxic truth. I'm talking about Chocolove. You can find their beautifully wrapped bars in high-end UK organic shops and online retailers like Ocado. Consumers love them because they look like love letters, but their dark chocolate holds a genuinely terrifying secret. When independent laboratory researchers at Consumer Reports ran comprehensive heavy metal testing on mainstream dark chocolates, Chocolove's range completely failed safety thresholds. Specifically, their strong dark chocolate containing 70% cocoa registered a staggering 152% of the maximum allowable dose level for lead. If you think that's bad, their extreme dark chocolate with 88% cocoa reached an unbelievable 240% of the safe limit, alongside dangerous concentrations of cadmium. These heavy metals don't just pass through you. They linger in human bones and organs for decades. Ingestion of lead at these proportions hits your central nervous system, driving up hypertension and destroying immune function. Paying nearly £4 a bar for a product that actively poisons your bloodstream isn't just a bad deal. It's a corporate disgrace. If you think the premium niche brands are bad, the high street mainstream is far more tragic. Let's talk about a brand that feels like a betrayal of British heritage: Cadbury. For the last decade and a half, British consumers have been complaining that their beloved dairy milk tastes fundamentally different, waxy, and overly sweet. This isn't nostalgia playing tricks on your mind. It is historical fact. The decline began explicitly in 2010 when the American giant Kraft bought the company, later spinning it into the global mega conglomerate Mondelez. To aggressively claw back the billions spent on the acquisition, Mondelez gutted the classic British infrastructure. They shut down key UK factories, where food standards are strictly monitored, and shifted large portions of manufacturing to factories in Poland and Egypt. Then came the devastating recipe manipulation. They systematically dropped the minimum cocoa solids and began aggressively swapping real cocoa butter with cheaper alternatives like palm oil, shea butter, and an absolute avalanche of refined sugar. This is why a modern bar of Cadbury feels slimy on your palate instead of melting beautifully. Palm oil is packed with saturated fats that strain your cardiovascular system, while the sheer volume of cheap sugar triggers insulin resistance and metabolic syndrome. They traded a piece of British identity for cheap industrial fat. And if you're shocked by what happened to Cadbury, wait until you see what the Swiss giant Nestlé is doing to your childhood favorites. Walk into any Tesco or Sainsbury's and you'll see rows of Kit Kats, Aero bars, and Munchies. But here is the cold truth. Nestlé is not a chocolate company. It is an industrial food conglomerate that manufactures chocolate-flavored sugar wax. If you flip over a standard British Kit Kat and read the ingredient list, the reality is devastating. The top ingredients are sugar, wheat flour, and skimmed milk powder. Real chocolate doesn't even make it into the top 3. Instead, the recipe relies heavily on palm kernel oil, whey powder, and industrial emulsifiers like PGPR, which is polyglycerol polyricinoleate, a cheap chemical byproduct used to reduce the viscosity of low-grade chocolate so it flows through factory machinery smoothly. Nestlé's global cocoa sourcing has been endlessly slammed by human rights organizations for systemic child labor failures across West Africa. Despite making public pledges for decades, their supply chains remain utterly compromised. You are paying a premium to a massive conglomerate for a product that completely replaces nutrition with cheap palm fat and compromised ethical standards. Speaking of iconic brands ruined by corporate takeovers, let's talk about the ultimate airport impulse buy: Toblerone. No trip through Heathrow or Gatwick duty-free used to be complete without grabbing one of those massive triangular bars. But since Mondelez took the reins of this legendary brand, everything that made it special has been systematically erased. If you've eaten a Toblerone recently, you'll have noticed the dramatic reduction in the honey and almond nougat. What used to be a crisp, premium texture has transformed into a gummy, sticky mess because that nougat is now heavily supplemented with cheap glucose syrup and dextrose fillers. But the ultimate marketing scam happened recently. You might have noticed the famous silhouette of the Swiss Matterhorn mountain vanished from the packaging. That's because Mondelez quietly shifted production out of Switzerland to a low-cost facility in Bratislava, Slovakia. Because of strict Swiss law, they could no longer legally claim the product was Swiss-made. Yet, when you buy it at Morrison's or Asda, you are still paying a premium price for what you assume is heritage Alpine confectionery, when in reality, you are buying a mass-produced Eastern European bar built on a supply chain heavily criticized for exploitation. It's an absolute illusion. If you already feel like checking your kitchen cupboards to see what rubbish you've been buying, hit that subscribe button right now, because the deeper we dig into these supermarket shelves, the darker the corporate secrets get. Let's look at a brand that has successfully tricked the British public into believing it represents high society: Ferrero Rocher. Sold in those rigid plastic boxes with individual gold foil wrapping, they charge a small fortune at Christmas and Valentine's Day. But let's pull back the gold foil. When Michele Ferrero created the recipe in the late 70s, each sphere contained a pristine, whole-roasted hazelnut. Today, to aggressively cut production costs, those whole nuts have frequently been swapped for fragmented hazelnut pieces, allowing them to recycle structural rejects. To make matters worse, the outer coating has become distinctly waxy. They have reduced the actual cocoa solids, amplified the refined palm oil content, and replaced natural vanilla bean flavor with synthetic vanillin and soy lecithin. Each tiny 12-gram ball is an absolute disaster for your health, packed with over 5 grams of industrial fat and nearly 5 grams of pure sugar. You are paying luxury prices for cheap fat, chemical preservatives, and factory floor leftovers wrapped in gold paint. But fake luxury isn't exclusive to the supermarket aisle. It has infected specialized boutiques too, which brings us to Godiva. For decades, Godiva was viewed as the absolute pinnacle of premium Belgian chocolate, found in high-end department stores like Selfridges and Harrods. However, after being passed around by various international private equity firms, the brand has completely lost its soul. In fact, consumers launched a massive $15 million class action lawsuit against the brand for false advertising, because the chocolate being sold at premium prices wasn't even made in Belgium and lacked the basic structural properties of authentic chocolate. They settled the lawsuit, but made the payout process an absolute logistical nightmare for ordinary people. This corporate greed isn't new. They famously tried to use aggressive legal bullying against a tiny independent business in Coventry simply because it used the historical name of Lady Godiva. Despite the premium aesthetic of their 20-pound gift boxes, the ingredient deck is littered with cheap vegetable oils, artificial flavorings, and heavy chemical emulsifiers. To top it off, independent testing flagged their dark chocolate lines for elevated lead levels. It's a corporate bully selling cheap, contaminated ingredients under a stolen flag of luxury. Let's move down to a brand that dominates the holiday gifting market across UK pharmacies like Boots and discount stores like B&M. Russell Stover. This brand is notorious in the corporate world for atrocious business practices, ranging from exploiting labor loopholes to cheating staff out of overtime pay. But if you look at the actual product, it's even worse. Russell Stover tastes exactly like where it's sold, a pharmacy. They use some of the lowest grade, highly processed industrial cocoa bases available on the global market. Their sugar-free range, highly marketed to diabetics and health-conscious consumers in the UK, is a literal digestive nightmare. Their sugar-free mint patties rely on maltitol, a cheaply manufactured sugar alcohol, alongside hydrogenated palm kernel oil and sorbitol. While maltitol has fewer calories than sugar, it causes massive, unpredictable blood sugar spikes that can be highly dangerous. Furthermore, the combination of maltitol and sorbitol possesses a documented, powerful laxative effect that completely wreaks havoc on your gastrointestinal tract. For their standard ranges, they rely on massive quantities of glucose-fructose syrup as the primary sweetener. It is cheap, highly inflammatory chemical sludge disguised as a comforting treat. Now, let's look at a brand that took corporate arrogance to an entirely new level: Lindt Excellence. Lindt is positioned across every Sainsbury's, Waitrose, and Tesco in the UK as the gold standard of accessible Swiss sophistication. But Lindt was exposed by Consumer Reports as having dangerous levels of heavy metal contamination in its dark chocolate lines. When outraged consumers took them to court for putting public health at risk, Lindt's legal defense team didn't deny the laboratory findings. Instead, they launched an argument that should infuriate every single person watching. Lindt argued that the lawsuit should be completely dismissed because terms on their packaging like expertly crafted, excellence, and finest ingredients were merely exaggerated marketing fluff that no reasonable consumer should ever actually believe. Let that sink in. A brand you trust is openly admitting in a court of law that their promises of quality are a total sham, while calling you foolish for believing them. Their highly publicized internal sustainable farming program is completely unverified by any independent third-party auditing bodies. Lindt Excellence isn't a premium product. It's a masterclass in corporate gaslighting wrapped in a shiny foil wrapper. That brings us to the absolute worst offender, a product line that floods UK discount shops, pound shops, and seasonal markets during Easter and Christmas: cheap, generic novelty chocolate shapes, best exemplified by mass-market compound brands like Palmer. You see these everywhere: massive foil-wrapped Easter bunnies, hollow Santa Clauses, and cartoon-themed coins. If you examine the packaging closely, you will notice a bizarre legal quirk. The word chocolate is completely missing from the front of the box. Instead, they use phrases like chocolate-flavored candy or chocolatey coating. This is because, under strict food labeling laws, it is illegal to call this product chocolate. Real chocolate requires cocoa butter. This industrial rubbish completely replaces cocoa butter with hydrogenated vegetable oils and cheap palm fats. Sugar is listed as the absolute primary ingredient, followed by a chemical cocktail of hydrogenated palm kernel oil, PGPR, and artificial vanillin flavor. It has a horrific, waxy texture that refuses to melt in your mouth, leaving a greasy film that coats the back of your throat for hours. You are paying for pure trans fats that actively clog your arteries and drive up systemic inflammation. It is a highly processed chemical novelty masquerading as food, and it belongs in the bin, not your body. And now, what it was worth watching all the way through for. We are finally leaving the corporate grease and the legal gaslighting behind to look at the brands that actually respect your body, your wallet, and the farmers who harvest the crops. You don't have to give up chocolate to stay healthy. You just need to stop buying industrial candy and start buying real food. The transition from the bad to the good is an absolute revelation for your taste buds, and every single one of these options can be pulled straight off British shelves. Let's kick things off with the most mainstream, highly accessible option on the good list, a brand you can find in almost every Tesco, Sainsbury's, and Waitrose across the UK, Green and Black's Organic. Founded in London back in 1991, this brand built its entire identity on pioneering organic, ethically sourced cocoa long before it became a marketing buzzword. While they were eventually acquired by a larger entity, they managed to fiercely protect their core production standards. Their signature organic 85% dark chocolate bar is a masterclass in clean formulation. Flip it over and you won't find a single drop of palm oil, PGPR, or artificial vanillin. The ingredient deck is brilliantly sparse. Organic cocoa mass, organic cocoa butter, a touch of organic fat-reduced cocoa powder, organic raw cane sugar, and a natural extract of Madagascan vanilla. Ocado is show one because they use high-proportion, unadulterated cocoa butter. The sensory experience is completely different from the waxy high street rubbish. The moment a square hits your tongue, it snaps cleanly and melts instantly, releasing an intense bittersweet profile that carries subtle fruit notes without a trace of chemical aftertaste. Price-wise, it is incredibly honest. A 90-gram bar usually sits around the £3 mark, which works out to roughly 60 pence per serving. It is slightly more expensive than a generic bar of Cadbury, but you are paying for genuine cocoa infrastructure instead of sugar and vegetable fat. It's the perfect everyday baseline for someone looking to clean up their diet without hunting down a specialty shop. If you want to step up the ethical ladder while keeping things incredibly mainstream and affordable. Your next stop is Tony's Chocolonely, which dominates the confectionery aisles of major supermarkets like Morrison's, Asda, and Co-op. Tony's started in the Netherlands with a loud, aggressive philosophy to make the global chocolate supply chain 100% slave-free. They pay cocoa farmers in Ghana and Ivory Coast a direct premium that sits way above the standard fair trade price, actively combating poverty-driven child labor at the root. Now, when independent laboratories flagged their 70% dark chocolate for baseline lead levels, Tony's didn't hide behind corporate lawyers. They completely transformed their supply monitoring and publicly backed stringent European Food Safety Authority standards, ensuring their chunky bars remain entirely safe for regular consumption. Eating a bar of Tony's dark almond sea salt or their plain 70% dark is a completely physical experience. The bars are intentionally cast in thick, unevenly divided blocks to mirror the inequality of the cocoa industry. It is dense, deeply satisfying, and has an incredibly rich, buttery mouthfeel because they refuse to skim out the natural fats. At around £3.50 for a massive, heavy 180-gram bar, the cost per use is remarkably low. The only minor downside is that because the blocks are so incredibly thick, they can be a bit of a jawbreaker if you keep them in the fridge. But that is a tiny price to pay for uncompromised ethics and pure ingredients, for those who want to experience true, award-winning artisan quality that can still be ordered easily online via Ocado or found in premium food halls. We have to talk about Pump Street Chocolate. Operating out of a small family-run bakery in Orford, Suffolk, Pump Street is the pride of British craft chocolate making. They operate a strict bean-to-bar model, which means they import raw, single-origin cacao beans directly from specific family estates in places like Jamaica, Ecuador, and Madagascar, then roast and stone grind them completely in-house. They use absolutely zero chemical preservatives, no industrial emulsifiers, and zero soy lecithin. Their dark ranges consist of just cacao, cane sugar, and natural cocoa butter, often incorporating crumbs from their own sourdough bread for an insane texture profile. The taste of Pump Street is an absolute cascade of natural flavor. Because the cacao isn't chemically stripped or overprocessed, you can actually taste the terroir, the specific soil and climate where the beans grew. It might taste naturally of red berries, or molasses, or single malt whiskey completely derived from the bean itself. Now let's be completely honest about the price. It is premium. A single 70-gram bar will cost you around £6 to £7. That sounds incredibly steep until you realize that this isn't a bar you mindlessly inhale while watching television. One single square delivers a more intense, authentic cocoa experience than 3 entire supermarket bars combined. It is a luxurious, clean superfood meant to be savored slowly, completely justifying the British artisan markup. Finally, sitting right at the top of the absolute purest options available to British consumers is Divine Chocolate. Widely stocked in Waitrose, Oxfam shops, and premium health stores. Divine is entirely unique because the company is literally co-owned by a cooperative of cocoa farmers in Ghana called Kuapa Koku. The farmers own a massive 44% stake in the company, meaning they directly share in the commercial profits of every single bar sold in the UK. When it comes to chemical and heavy metal safety, Divine scores exceptionally well because their agricultural methods are incredibly tightly controlled by the farmers themselves. Their 90% smooth dark chocolate bar is a triumph of clean eating. It contains only cocoa mass, cocoa butter, sugar, and natural vanilla, completely avoiding the cadmium and lead traps of lower-tier industrial brands. The texture is velvety, deep, and remarkably smooth for such a high percentage, completely lacking the bitter, chalky dryness of poorly made corporate dark chocolate. It sits at a highly reasonable price point of around £3 per bar, offering the absolute best balance of systemic ethics, laboratory purity, and affordable luxury. It is proof that you can buy pristine, life-saving chocolate without breaking the bank. Now that you know exactly which brands are treating you like an open wallet, and which ones are pouring genuine, high-grade ingredients into their wrappers, you need to know how to police the confectionery aisle entirely on your own. When you're walking down the sweet aisle at Sainsbury's, Asda, or Waitrose, you don't need to guess anymore. You just need to follow a few stone-cold, non-negotiable rules to filter out the corporate rubbish instantly. First, flip the bar over and look at the very first item on the ingredient deck. If the first word you see is sugar, drop it immediately and walk away. You are buying a block of frosted candy, not actual chocolate. Real, health-boosting chocolate must always list cocoa mass, cocoa liquor, or cacao beans as the absolute primary ingredient. Second, treat the words palm oil, palm kernel oil, or vegetable fat like an absolute red flag. If any of these are listed, the manufacturer has stripped out the high-value cocoa butter to sell it to cosmetic companies and replaced it with cheap, arterial-clogging trans fats to save pennies on the factory floor. Third, check for the industrial emulsifier PGPR on the label. This chemical byproduct is a definitive green light for low-quality processing. It's used exclusively to force cheap, high-sugar sludge through mass production machinery, meaning the brand cares about mechanical speed rather than real texture. Fourth, actively look for third-party certifications like Fairtrade or Rainforest Alliance, but prioritize direct trade statements on the packaging. Brands that explicitly list the specific estates or cooperatives they source from, like Divine or Tony's, have highly transparent supply chains that are vastly less susceptible to heavy metal contamination and human exploitation. Finally, look at the physical snap of the bar when you break off a square. Real, expert tempering of high-quality cocoa butter produces a clean, sharp, cracking sound at room temperature, whereas cheap vegetable oil knockoffs bend softly, leaving a greasy, waxy film on your fingers. This is the ultimate roadside test for quality. When you strip away the massive marketing campaigns and the nostalgic childhood branding, the reality of the global confectionery industry is remarkably simple. The megacorporations that dominate our high streets have systematically turned a medicinal, antioxidant-rich superfood into a cheap, highly processed chemical vehicle for sugar and industrial fat. They have engineered their products to exploit your evolutionary biology, keeping you addicted to low-grade sweets while using aggressive legal tactics and public relations spin to cover up heavy metal contamination and supply chain horrors. To stop being a victim of this massive high-street marketing scam, you only need to make one definitive shift in your daily thinking: stop treating chocolate as a mindless, cheap commodity impulse buy at the supermarket checkout and start treating it as a premium, single-ingredient food that requires pure agricultural integrity. Thank you so much for pulling up a chair and cracking into the truth with me today. If you want to make sure your mates and family stop feeding their kids waxy palm fat and toxic heavy metals disguised as holiday treats, share this video with someone who constantly keeps a massive stash of corporate chocolate in their kitchen cupboard. I want to hear from you directly down in the comments section. Look inside your kitchen right now and tell me exactly which of these brands is sitting on your shelves. If you want to see how the exact same corporate shortcuts are being pulled off in the drinks industry, click on this next video right here, where we expose the massive household coffee brands that are quietly selling you synthetic chemicals and metabolic chaos in a single morning cup. Keep your eyes open, read the labels, and look after yourself.